Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the Managing Director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. The title of this video is Notions of Equity in Thailand, and that's probably something of a daunting title for some, or maybe some people just don't simply understand exactly what I'm talking about here. But there is something I've noticed with people that are foreign that come to move to Thailand and live here, is that they have some misnomers about how the legal system, if you will, works in Thailand. And what I'm talking about here with respect to equity, and I'm not going to get too deep into what equity specifically is, other than, just sort of a surface definition, but in the common law system, which is utilized throughout much of the Commonwealth and the United States and the UK, there's this notion of equity that goes back sort of to medieval times with respect to get into the history of it would be of not much use here. But what it goes back to is there used to be notions of law, which you could have a decision at law that was unequitable, meaning sort of unfair, that even though it was following the strict interpretation of the law. So basically in the common law system, this notion of equity was formed. The notion came from something called the Court of the King's Conscience. It was basically a notion that, okay, we have this legal system, but sometimes there's decisions that are made under the legal system interpreting the law that don't result in a fair outcome for people in practice. So they created this notion of equity. In the American system, this notion of equity and this notion of law was sort of blended back together. In the British system, it's my understanding that there's still sort of a notion of a court of chancery, which has sort of a slightly different function than the courts of law. The only reason I'm bringing this up is these are ideas that are fairly deeply ingrained in most, at least Anglo-Americans' sense of sort of legal thinking or sense of fairness. It's an assumption that's made as to how things work in the real world and how sort of the courts are going to look at things if a matter was ever adjudicated. In Thailand, this notion of equity simply really doesn't exist in the same way that we think of it in the Western or in the common law system. Most notably, this comes to the forefront in matters involving quote-unquote trusts. In Thailand, there virtually are no quote-unquote trusts. There is no notion of trust in Thailand. Trust the way we think of it in a legal sense in, say, the United States or the Commonwealth. And what I'm talking about here is the notion under trust law, and I don't mean to get too deep, but there's a bifurcation of legal ownership and equitable ownership. So someone, for example, this happens in the case of, say, nominees. We have so-called nominee shareholders. They own it in their name, but there's an agreement between that nominee and some other party that, in fact, those shares are actually owned by this other party whose name is not on the shares. In Thailand, that simply does not exist. In fact, nominee shareholders are explicitly illegal pursuant to the Foreign Business Act of the Kingdom of Thailand, and some various other statutory law here. So nominees and these notions just simply don't exist the way that Westerners think of them. Another thing to bear in mind with respect to notions of equity. For example, here in Thailand, you'll often see American or foreign of any nationality having a house, but that house is in their wife's name. And then, there's sort of an assumption that just because it's in the wife's name, you have some stake in that house, and in the event of some dispute or something, or maybe a divorce, that house, or at least some partition of value, is going to be allocated to you, to an individual whose name isn't necessarily on the title deed of that house, but they feel like that they have some equitable interest in that home. That's really generally not the way that the legal system here operates, and this is just a general sort of overview of how there's a different way of thinking when it comes to these sort of issues that we think of that in the West are basically called equity. It just simply doesn't exist in the same way in Thailand. That's not to say that the Thai courts are in any way unfair. In fact, the Thai courts often will go out of their way to be fair. But these notions of just assuming that because even though something's in somebody else's name, oh, I actually have an interest in that. That may hold true for a court in say the United States or the Commonwealth, where they may look into the situation and say, well, actually, out of a need to have an equitable partition in this matter, you know, even though so-and-so's name isn't necessarily on this property or on these shares or whatever, there was an agreement, and due to equity, we're gonna make this right, make this fair, make it equitable. In Thailand, that's not necessarily how things are going to play out. So much like the video on this channel regarding things to think of before coming to Thailand, this is something to think of when living here. Is that there aren't these notions that we're used to operating under in a Western paradigm, or at least these notions are not as strongly held, or are definitely not the kind of foundations to the legal system here that they are in the West. It's just something to ponder.